All right, guys, we're going to open in a word of prayer. All right. Dear God, I just thank you for tonight, and I thank you for everybody that can come here tonight and worship with us. God, I just pray that everything that we do can glorify you. And God, I pray for all the services going on tonight, from everybody upstairs to the kids and youth age downstairs. God, I pray for everybody going home, and I pray for the rest of their weeks. In Jesus' name, amen. Please stand and sing with us.
Keep my eyes above the waves. My soul will rest in your embrace, for I am yours, and you are mine.
Okay. Well, I've got kind of an exciting week. On the way over here, I talked to my dad and told him my dad was a pastor and pastored for over 65 years, had some really phenomenal ministries. He has baptism numbers, led people to Christ. He was in a mission plant church, started a church in Peoria. Right this fall after World War II, he came back from the war, went to seminary, went up there, started church, and in 3 years, they had over 150 baptisms in 3 years. Church just exploded. They planted a church across from a brand new housing complex that really was for GIs coming back. That's kind of what it was in the Peoria area. So he just had great ministry. I told him, well, I'm on my way to Steelville, do prayer meeting, do church. And he said, well, give them something good. So I don't know what that means, but he and I talked. My dad will be 100 on Friday. And so he's still going good. He's in assisted living. He had a little up and down, but he's back in assisted living. And so he's done a pretty good job of a lot of good things. And honestly, I was thinking a little bit, it's one thing to be 100 years old. It's another thing to have lived 100 years pretty much always honoring the Lord. In fact, he wrote a little thing that he wanted to send Mature Living as a magazine for old Baptists is what it is. But he wrote it last year, and it was 99 years of going to church. And he said, according to my mother, I didn't go to church after I was born and for the first 3 weeks. But after that, there have been very few Sundays in my entire life, 99 years, that I've not been to church. And then he went through, when I moved away from home, went to a civilian conservation camp when there were no jobs in Southern Illinois. When he graduated from high school, there just weren't jobs here at all. And so he went to a CC camp and had to decide, would he go to church or not on Sunday when they let out on weekends, because most guys didn't. Then he went to World War II, and we got off the base. Was he going to go to church or not? And then just throughout all of his life, different changes. Of course, he said, well, you got to be a Baptist pastor. It was easier to decide to go to church. It was kind of important. But then it was, when I can't drive anymore, I still want to go to church if there's any way I can. And then even now, physically, he's not able to go every week. He just physically sometimes isn't. But he says, I can go to church on television, but it just this idea of, there's something about, you can live a long life, but there's some lives not really worth living. But to live a life that honors the Lord. So we're going to celebrate. We're going to do some of that kind of stuff. So we've been talking about the Bible. And we've kind of led up to getting to interpretation. And obviously when you interpret anything in the Bible, you read it. You just read, what does the Scripture say? But if you're really going to get into deeper levels of understanding, at some point you begin to take into what we call the context. And the context has to do with, if I want to look at this verse, what did the verse before say? What did the verse after say? What did the chapter before say? What did the chapter afterwards say? And then what was some of the context, the background for that book that verse was in? And at some point, you always get to the historical background. How does the Christmas story start? In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2. It came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxation was made when Cyrenius was governor of... Anyway, that says there's a historical background to that event. And throughout all the Bible, every single book of the Bible has a historical background. And so I wanted to just go on that a little bit. And one of the ways that I thought might be is that chronologically there are a number of empires, nations, that basically were the backdrop for books of the Bible. And the way that I remember them is the phrase, "Eat in at Bob's Pretty Good Restaurant." So, to start with, the first empire that really plays into the context of the Bible, you could say the Canaanites. There would be an argument for that. When Abram left the nation or the land of Ur in what we know as Babylon now, he came to the land of Canaan. So Genesis kind of does that. So you could say, come eat in at Bob's Pretty Good Restaurant. But I'm going to start with Egypt. This is my map because I couldn't find one, so I just made one up. And we have some rules about drawing. We don't make fun of how people draw. But I discovered a long time ago, sometimes it's just easier to draw your own map. And so on the map, this is kind of the center, this little body of water here. Anybody know what that is? Sea of Galilee. Very good. And the Sea of Galilee drains south, and probably next week, maybe next week, we'll talk about some of the geography. The watershed of the Galilee is one of the most important things politically in the Middle East. The reason the Golan Heights was such a big deal is because water rains into the Golan Heights and drops down into the Sea of Galilee. Then the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River runs south out of the Sea of Galilee, and it runs down to something called the... And why is the Dead Sea dead? It has no outlet. The only way that water leaves the Dead Sea is by evaporation. And over the years, centuries, as the water evaporates, the mineral content has gotten so strong, and particularly salts, is so significant that nothing can live in it. It's also why you can't hardly sink in the Dead Sea. It's also actually dying now, actually pretty quickly. There's a thought that maybe in 50 years there won't be any Dead Sea anymore, and it's because Jordan and Israel keep taking water out. And they're using the water for so many other things that not very much gets down to the Dead Sea anymore. So it's shrinking, and it's getting smaller all the time. That's Israel, and Jerusalem is always right at the head of the Dead Sea and just a little bit over. So this is Israel. Egypt, of course, is down here to the south. By the middle of the book of Genesis, Joseph is in Egypt. And Egypt is the great empire that is the first one really that plays out in the Bible. Obviously, Jacob and all of his sons get down there. Joseph is there. They are there for 400 years. And there's a Pharaoh who doesn't remember Joseph, and they are put in prison, and they are put into slave labor. And so Egypt is the first great empire. And probably, you can always, if you get different Bible study notes, they'll say different things, but most likely, Abraham is around 1700 BC. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob take about 100 years to get down through those generations, and then the Israelites are in Egypt for 400 years, and so that would put the Exodus around 1200. Nobody knows. There is a pharaoh by the name of Ramses, and if you remember in the book of Exodus it says they were building cities. They were building a city called Ramses and Pithom. Now there are several Ramses, we don't know, but the first great empire is almost certainly Egypt. And then the second one is kind of surprising to folks, but Israel was actually a pretty great empire at one time. David becomes king, and if you're looking at just round dates, David is in Jerusalem about 1000 BC. He's in Jerusalem, and he's stormed the city. He sent soldiers up the water course. They got in the city. They conquered it. David at 1000 BC is in there, and then 40 years later, his son Solomon becomes king. And Solomon actually was pretty great. He is mentioned in the histories of other empires. Most of what we know about ancient history, we don't know from Israel. They didn't keep really very significant records. But the other people did. Other folks knew about Solomon. And Solomon developed great wealth. And he made Israel a very great country. They had trading partners. He created political alliances. Remember all those marriages? Y'all thought he was just dumb. Well, he may have been for being wise. I don't know, 700 wives and 300 concubines. But as best we know, all of those were political alliances. And so he would make a deal with this person and this person and these people. And he made alliances with all of the ancient world around him. The Queen of Sheba, that's down in Egypt, or down in Africa. And he created great trading partners, and he literally was a kind of an emperor, and the nation of Israel for a period of time was one of the great powers. He built great armies. We know that he had chariots. Megiddo is a fabulous fortress that had all kinds of room for chariots, and I mean, he had fortresses built all around Israel. So for a period of time, Israel was very great. Now, you know that when Solomon died, he had a really dumb son. He had two boys, Rehoboam, well, he had a lot. If you have 1,000 wives, you have a lot of kids. But he had the top two were Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And he said, Rehoboam, I want you to be the king. And Solomon died. Rehoboam's ready to be the king. And all of the senior adult advisors came to him and they said, Rehoboam, all this stuff your dad did, all these cities he built, these fortresses, all that stuff, that was done with forced labor. Would you just back off a little bit? And if you do, everybody will follow you. And his young advisor said, no, you got to be tougher than your dad. And he listened to the young guys. And everybody said, in fact, he said, my dad, this was his thigh compared to me. I'm going to be a lot bigger than him. And basically the nation of Israel split. And it became Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And it's the time of the divided kingdoms. But the deal is, all of the alliances, all of the armies, all of the fortresses were still there. And Israel has peace for a period of time, for about 100 plus years. And eventually other nations start to come in, but they are at peace for a while during Israel, the United Monarchy, and then Eat-in-At, which is who? The Assyrians. Now, these are the Syrians. Syria is right there. These are the Assyrians. I don't really know why, but that's who they are. The Assyrians become the next great empire. Kings, Chronicles, that's all during the time of Israel, Judea, the divided kingdom. But during the time of the Assyrians, Sennacherib, Ashurbanipal, they began and became a great emperor, and they came and invaded Israel from the north. In 721 BC, they invaded the north and they conquered the nation of Israel up in the north. And they got to Jerusalem, and there was a king who went and prayed. Remember who the king was? Hezekiah. And he went and prayed, and God delivered them from the Assyrians. And so that Judah stayed free for about another 150 years. But as far as biblical books, there was a guy, a prophet, who didn't want to go to Assyria. At least he didn't want to go to the chief city, one of the chief cities of Assyria. It was Nineveh. Well, if we learn a little bit about the Assyrians, you almost kind of understand why he didn't want to go. They were not nice folks. They were very cruel. And by the way, they're the ones who, when they invaded, they pretty much just came in and they said, I know you live here, and we think if you are moved, you won't rebel as likely if you're in a place that wasn't your hometown. And they would just take entire folks and move them someplace else. And then they brought other people and transplanted them. Have you heard about the Samaritans? Well, the Samaritans were people who intermarried with the folks the Assyrians brought in. And so all of that story all plays from the Assyrians. Eat in at Bob's. The Babylonians. There's two rivers over here, the Tigris, or the Euphrates, and the Tigris. And where they come together, that's Babylon. And the Babylonians come. Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, those guys are playing a part of that. And in about 600 BC, they went to war with the Assyrians, conquered them. And now, just from geographics, this is a desert. Nobody marches from here over this way. If you're going to go to Israel from Babylon, you got to go up along the rivers where there's water and roads, and you always invade Israel from the north. They always came in from the north. So the Babylonians came. They conquered the Assyrians. They came down, and they, in 587 BC, destroyed the city of Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, tore it down so there was not one stone upon another. They took everything that was of any value from the temple and took it to Babylon as spoils. They took, and we don't really know how many, but literally thousands of captives. And they took them from Israel and took them to Babylon to be slaves. The most famous of them probably was Daniel and his three buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Or my shack, your shack, and a bungalow, or anyway, I'm not sure about those, but the book of Daniel is all set within the Babylonian conquest. Jeremiah is a prophet during the time of the Babylonian reign. He's a prophet in Israel. Ezekiel is a prophet during that time who goes and lives in Babylon. And by the way, if you think you ever got a weird pastor, just what would it be if you had Ezekiel for a pastor? I mean, you know, instead of being out visiting, he just lays on his side all day, every day, and then he turns and lays on his other side, and he never has anything nice to say. But at any rate, those are all during the time of the Babylonians. Eat in at Bob's, and you get Ezekiel, Babylon, then pretty good restaurant, Persia. And by the way, modern time, this is Iraq. This is Iran. This used to be Armenia. Now it was some of the Soviet states, the Kazakhstan, some of those kind of states are all up in there. The Persians. And in 539 BC, the Persians invaded Babylon. In fact, the story is in 539 BC, Cyrus, who was the emperor of Persia at that time, led his army to the city of Babylon, and there was a waterway. The Euphrates River flowed right through the city. And they had a little archway to let that go through. And in the middle of the night, the Persian armies stopped the Euphrates, and they marched soldiers through the watercourse into the city, and they caught the city in the midst of a huge celebration and party, and they laid waste to the city of Babylon. That may be the story of Belshazzar and the handwriting of the wall, and Daniel says, this night, the judgment of God is coming. So that could be. But that's 539 BC. The Persians allow those captives to go back home. And some do. Not all of them. Some of them stay here. Daniel hangs around. Daniel's serving the Babylonians, and when the Persians come in, he starts serving the Persians. And there are Persians, Jews, who find their way up into the Persian hierarchy. And of course, during the time of the Persians, starting about 539 BC, Esther happens to be a queen in one of the capital cities, Susa and Ecbatana. Nehemiah is a cupbearer for one of the kings of Persia, who is burdened by Jerusalem's being destroyed, and he goes all the way back and gets the ability to go back and build the wall. Ezra is a priest who is here, and he also is burdened, and he goes back, and there's a revival because they stand and start reading the Bible, and they start reading the Scriptures. Haggai is a prophet during that time who, I think, is he the one who says, Haggai, or who says, is it right for you to live in houses with paneled walls while the house of God is in ruins? By the way, if you live in a geography they don't have big trees, how expensive is paneling? I mean, if you don't have huge oak trees like we have and big paneled walls is a big deal. That's a kind of a neat statement that he's saying. You're spending all this money to have wood paneling here in Israel, and the house of God is in ruins. Yes?
Wasn't it at that time that they had collected all this wood and everything to rebuild the temple, and it lay stagnant? So all that material, they started using it for other things instead of building the temple.
Very well be. There's some different ways to look at that. But yes, it was laid in waste, and they were going to try and build it. When they finally did get around to build it, it didn't look like it used to look. Anyway, but that's all within the context of the Persians. So eating at Bob's, pretty good, is Greece. 333 BC. We've talked about Alexander the Great. I really am not proud of the Mediterranean Sea that I have drawn. This is Asia Minor, and this is Greece, and Rome is that far. I started too close, I'm sorry. This is Rome over here. There's a boot that sticks down. But in 333 BC, rightly, Alexander the Great starts marching this way. And he conquers this area, and he conquers Greece, and he conquers here. And in fact, he goes all the way to India. And as he goes, what does he make everybody learn? Greek. And Greek culture and Greek philosophy. He just doesn't teach them. And actually, he was really big on literacy. He made people learn. You couldn't work for any government official if you didn't read Greek. So there was a big press on that. There are a lot of different groups following that. And Greece kind of was not as oppressive after Alexander died. But there were groups here, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, the story of Hanukkah, the cleansing of the temple. There was a group called the Seleucids that were very much anti-Jewish. They sacrificed pigs on the altar in the temple. And there was a group called the Maccabees who led a revolt and freed Israel during that time, about 165 BC. They led a revolt, and they wanted to cleanse the temple. And the big deal was they needed special oil to burn in the temple. Had to have a special, had frankincense, it's kind of a specific thing mentioned in the Old Testament. And they didn't have hardly any left. But they used what they started, and it lasted in the lamp for 8 days. And so that's why the menorahs in Hanukkah have 8. By the way, some have 9 and some have 7. Jews are kind of like Baptists. They just can't agree on details always. So there are menorahs that have 7 and some that have 8. But anyway, it's because miraculously the oil lasted for all those days. So the Greek times, there's not really a Bible story. There's not a book of the Bible that really occurs during the time of the Greeks. But I think we talked there was probably not been another time in the history of the world that literally everybody in the world who was literate, who could read the same language. And there's something unique about God sending His Son and the gospel into the world in that moment. That when the New Testament came about, the gospel, it was probably one of the only times in the history of the world that everybody could read the very same language. I mean, that's pretty significant. So, eat in at Bob's Pretty Good Restaurant. So the Romans finally come. 63 BC is when they sort of invade Israel. They come down here, they conquer Israel, they conquer Egypt. They start and they conquer all of this area. And by the way, one of the big things the Romans did is they built roads. I mean, they built roads. They also had probably some of the best military in the history of the world. The Roman legions were, I mean, their tactics, their discipline, almost nobody could stand up to the Roman legions. They just walked through the world and destroyed them. Alexander the Great did it by numbers. He just would, if you had 10,000 people, he'd have 20,000. He did it that way. But the Romans were just some of the very best. But to move their legions, they built roads. And it's kind of an interesting thing. There was a better inter-country, I was going to say interstate, but a better set of roads at the time of Jesus coming into the world than there had ever been. There is a road that went from Rome, that came through Greece, came through Philippi, and then came on over down into Turkey and came down this way. It was called the Egnatian Road. Karen and I got to do we did a Journeys of Paul tour. The Egnatian Road's still there. I mean, you can still see it. It was made out of big chunks of marble, and it's laid out there. And I've told all of my friends in Effingham who work at DOT, they surely can do better than that. I mean, they built that road 3,000 years ago, and it's still around. But they built roads, and everywhere they went roads. And there were roads that went all over the place, so that when the Christians had to start scattering from persecution, and when it was time for the gospel to spread, there was a language that people understood. There were roads that were going. The Romans also were pretty big on building ships. And so the gospel was able to spread. So, you can't hardly read the New Testament without understanding something about Roman. Someone asks you to go 1 mile, how many miles are you supposed to go? 2. And that's because of Roman occupation. We understand. So bottom line is there's all of this kind of backdrop for the Bible, and whether you ever eat in at Bob's Pretty Good Restaurant or not. And you don't even necessarily need to remember that. That's not that big a deal. But it is kind of interesting whenever you're teaching a Sunday school class or you're studying your Sunday school lesson, anytime you approach the Bible, there's a backdrop that's just pretty important. Now, the other thing I really wanted to talk about, while I had my wonderfully quality map up here that I know you all appreciate. By the way, do any of you still have maps in your car? One of my girls was in my car the other day and opened the glove box, and there was a map, and she said, "Dad, what are you doing with this?" And I thought, man, well, anyway, I'm visual. I like to see it. I mean, I just do. At any rate, an interesting little thing to notice while we got all this up here. All of those great empires, do you see any connection at all? Where is Israel in the midst of them all? It's right in the middle. In fact, more than that, if you were in Assyria and you were going to try and do anything and conquer any place from Asia to Africa, where did you have to go? This is the desert. You can't come out here. Red Sea's way down here. Gulf of Aqaba's over there. If you're in Persia and you want to go to Egypt, where you got to go? If you're in Greece or Rome, if you're Julius Caesar and you got to get to Cleopatra somehow, where do you go? This is a land bridge. And Egypt, when they were conquering anybody, they went right through there. There was a road on this side called the King's Highway. And they're not really sure who was built. They think maybe the Nabateans built it. But there was a road, and isn't there some song about marching on the King's Highway? It's an old Sunday school song. But there was a road that came down and came through the desert and came down here. But the most logical place was to come, and if you were going to march an army, and you were going to come from Babylon, you couldn't come across the desert, so you marched your army along the river, and then you came up here through Lebanon, where they had mountains, but they had passes, and they had water, and you came down through here. And if you were going to be in Greece, and you wanted to attack Assyria or Persia, you can't leave your flank unguarded. You can't run the risk that an army might march from behind you and cut you off, so that when Alexander came through, before he went to Assyria, he came down here and he set up garrisons and he conquered this area, and then he went down to Greece and Egypt and conquered Egypt. And when the Romans came through on the Egnatian Road, they got up here, but before they went on, they came down here and they conquered this area so they could put garrisons and they could protect anything that would be an attack from their flank that would come up this side. So it kind of is it not just a little interesting that when God decided to send His Son into the world, although it seems like one of the most obscure, bizarre little portions in the entire world, that He sent His Son to a location that would be right smack in the middle of every one of the empires that was going to come, in a language that everybody's going to understand, at a time when there are roads and transportation and things that are going on. And by the way, there is another little interesting thing. The Canaanites probably had a written language before anybody else, which eventually probably spilled over into Hebrew, and how written Hebrew probably got to be. So there's a backdrop for all of the Bible, and some of it is these concepts of time, and God has got a background. Now this is all for free. There is no test. It's not necessary. There's no challenge. But you got any questions? Does any of that make sense to you? It's just kind of a different little picture. Now, what I think we'll do next week is we'll look at some of the geography of the nation of Israel itself, and some of the things about water, things about going up to Jerusalem, because that's about the highest. I mean, there's lots of interesting little things about how far it is, and so we'll talk, and I'll try and come up with some kind of map that we can do a little bit better. Yes?
I noticed it says Palestine here instead of.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Hadrian that named it.
Mm-hmm. Hadrian was a Roman general, and then eventually became an emperor. And,
Was that before Christ?
yes, that was all before, yeah, Hadrian was before Christ. Well, now there's two things. This region, and we'll talk about this next Wednesday night, this region around here, the Philistia, were the sea people, the Philistia, the Philistines. And the Philistines, this was a very fertile area down here. You could grow stuff down there, a lot of stuff you can't grow. By the way, you can grow rocks really well. For those of you who are gardeners, That is the reason why they stoned people, because at any moment, at any time, you could be mad at somebody and look down and there was a rock. They were always available. But I got to look up Hadrian. Somebody can Google him. I can't remember his date. Hadrian was one of the Roman emperors, and I can't remember his time frame. But he started calling it Philistia and Palestina, and that's where the word Palestine came from. So it was another term for the region. Before that was Canaan. There were other names that were used. Yeah, somebody will look it up. See, you guys are so good. That used to be you could just say anything in church. And now, man, I say something and people are Googling it. They're checking, did he just make that up? And I do sometimes. So anyway, and Hadrian built a huge wall in Britain. Hadrian did a lot of things. Hadrian's Wall kind of divided things in Britain for years. King Arthur supposedly, so he must have come later. But and then Palestine was also given that name when, well, maybe we'll save the nation of Israel in 1940 and 48, and well, maybe we'll get some of that other stuff. I don't know. Yes?
When we were in Israel, they said one reason that Jesus put his ministry starting point in Capernaum was because of the road that the Romans had built. And from Capernaum, it was the central hub. They could go pretty much anywhere.
Yep, and that's, well, yeah, we can probably say it, but Capernaum is here. Caesarea by the sea was over here. And Caesarea by the sea was the main Roman central authority in Palestine. And Caesarea by the sea. Caesarea Philippi is up here. And remember, Jesus took his disciples up to Caesarea Philippi and said, "Who do men say that I am?" Well, that was up here, but this part is Caesarea by the sea. And if you went to Israel, you probably went out. That's one of the neat places to go. That's where, so Herod would have been up here most of the time, but he would have come to Jerusalem. Pilate would have been up here most of the time, and he would have come down. So we can kind of play some of those other things. But it's a pretty good restaurant. You need to eat there now and then. Find it, figure it out. But it is kind of interesting to just remember all this backdrop makes understanding some of the events of the Bible, and every book of the Bible has and probably fits in one of those categories. Okay? Anything else? That's all I know. I'm going to erase this. We'll try it again. My very first seminary, I taught math. And I turned in my contract that had the word tenure on it. And I gave it back to the superintendent of the school, Warsaw, Illinois, and I said, "No, I'm going to seminary." So I gave it up, went to seminary. So I'd been teaching math. My very first class that summer was biblical backgrounds, Old Testament backgrounds. And we had a professor who gave us a blank map of the ancient world and a blank map of Israel. And the first test was you had to fill in all of this stuff. I hated him. And I thought, have I been causing kids this much pain when I've been given tests? I've been given tests for all these years. I mean, have I made them this miserable? But I will tell you, that's one of the best classes I ever took, just for a backdrop of everything else that goes on. So, all right, prayer requests for tonight.